Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Yulia Georgia. I teach at Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and I'm the director of the Black Sea program at the Middle East Institute. And I'm joined, as always, by Dalibor Rohac, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Later on in the show, we'll have, as an old but haven't been for a while with us guest, Fred Kagan, resident scholar at AEI and director of AEI's Critical Threats Project. But until then, on our podcast, we discuss security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, let us start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front. We'll talk about Romania, of course, since that has been in the headlines for quite a while. But before we do that, Dalibor just returned from Ukraine. So, Dalibor, over to you.
Thank you, Julia. No, it was a really interesting trip. So I was there with a group called Defenders of Faith and Religious Freedom in Ukraine, which is a group that is trying to bridge the sort of environments of the American sort of evangelical movements and churches and people who very often kind of form the real base of the Republican Party here, if you will, and Ukrainian evangelicals and various small Protestant churches, and trying to make the case to the Americans that they've been very often misinformed by Russian propaganda about who is really threatening religious freedom in Ukraine. So in some ways I was kind of a misfit on this trip because I am not really part of this community of American evangelicals, and I don't think I need to be particularly convinced by anybody about the threat that Russia is posing to religious freedom and freedom at large in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. But it was very interesting to join the trip and to be there with people who are far more plugged into, say, the Trump world than we are, and to see them sort of react to the reality on the ground. And in a way it's a testament to, I think, Ukrainians' kind of inventiveness and flexibility in the light of changing political circumstances in America, that they kind of understand that we are really moving to a new world, politically speaking, and that they need to make their arguments for US support to Ukraine in a perhaps slightly different shape and form.
I also want to know how people are thinking about Trump returning to the White House and the big talk about peace negotiations that we keep having in the West. It obviously concerns them, so I'm wondering what the vibe is in Ukraine.
I mean, it's look, it's a country of 40 million, so I can't give you like one Ukrainian view of the Trump administration. I've heard a variety of opinions from the Ukrainian interlocutors we've been meeting. I think many of them have been sort of skewed towards the kind of right of center conservative side. People are not really lamenting the end of the Biden administration. I think there has been a sense of frustration with the slow nature of the US response and the sort of drip character of the US assistance. But I don't think people are kind of like blindly enthusiastic about what's coming. I mean, the Ukrainians believe that this idea of negotiating with Putin is somewhat unrealistic in the light of the steady advances that the Russians have made on the battlefield. And everybody has emphasized that, if you want to negotiate and strike a deal with Putin, be somebody you can't trust, and you have to have sort of safeguards in place that ensure that any deal that's reached will stay in place. And they just don't see that quite yet, especially with the prospect of NATO membership being taken off the table. I was really impressed by Ukrainians' kind of commitment to their own nationhood. I mean, it's a really different country from what it was 10 years ago, and in my sort of weaker, more pessimistic moments, I'm kind of dreading the prospect of Ukrainian politics post a ceasefire or peace settlement, when you have this million of veterans coming back, and maybe they'll feel that they've been stabbed in the back by the West or abandoned by the West, and how that sort of plays out politically. But I think there is, what I saw was a sort of sense that they just, understand that they are in a tough spot and they want to make their country kind of work, and they do have survival instinct that we in the West, maybe we sort of haven't really flexed those muscles in a long time because we've sort of lived in this sort of cocooned, safe world for such a long time. But I think the Ukrainians kind of do prioritize the political survival of their nation, and I think that will serve them well in the difficult years ahead.
That's quite interesting how you're emphasizing after the visit or your takeaways, nationhood and issues of survival for whatever comes next. It seems like you're almost a few steps ahead. Before we segue to Romania, in which I just landed, by the way, I'm coming from a conference in Germany that was organized on Ukraine, 10 years of war on Ukraine. Shout out to the organizers, Mattia and Ina Nellis in the German Ukraine Bureau for organizing an absolutely fantastic event, one of the best I've been to in a long time. And it was heavily packed with Ukrainian civil society. We were a couple or so flown in from the United States on that side, of course, journalists and civil society from Germany as well, and a few more Europeans, but mostly Ukrainians. And of course, the big topic has been peace negotiations. And we even worked in workshops around what security guarantees mean, since we're turning around this whole concept a few times now in connection to NATO and in connection to bilateral possible security guarantees and the Kellogg Plan and the J.D. Vance proposal and all of these things. And beyond the content and beyond the many scenarios that we're looking at that, of course, are a big unknown, from the more private conversations, my takeaway was that Ukrainians are putting on a very calm and brave face because the point is actually that we're looking at something temporary, and the Europeans and those that are pro-Ukraine or are portraying themselves as being pro-Ukraine, they're saying, but of course, we need negotiations, never without Ukraine at the table. But the Ukrainians say, but we were at the table. Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, we were at the table, and look what came out of it. So what you're putting now on the table is no different in the end than Minsk 1 or Minsk 2, another ceasefire, temporary in nature, first of all, and second of all, with prospective major losses for Ukraine. And they didn't say that in public events, even though they had plenty of opportunity. So it was striking and also very painful to be aware of their perspective, putting yourselves into their shoes, how they're patient with us pro-Ukrainian Westerners and our emphasis on how peace negotiations should be with them, when actually there's nothing really to look forward to from their point of view long term.
One sort of thing that Ukrainians tend to emphasize is that, I mean, as of now, there is little indication that Russia is interested in negotiations. And I think there is, I don't know if it's a misplaced hope, but there's a sort of expectation that maybe like Trump himself will be disappointed when he tries to push Russians to negotiate, and they'll say, why should we negotiate? We want the whole thing. I'm not quite sure that will play out exactly in that fashion, but I think it's reasonable to sort of expect Russians to make very maximalist demands. And obviously then the question is whether the US administration will just acquiesce to those demands. I think it's important for us, I suppose, to sort of put pressure on everybody to make it just impossible politically to just say yes to whatever Putin asks for.
Indeed. The one thing that we didn't discuss at the conference, and it's more food for thought for me, is if I'm putting myself into Russian shoes, what could be put on the table for me to be tempted to not just grind on the way that I have, that seems to be quasi-sustainable based on the pattern of the last 2.5, 3 years. And that would be the prospect that is included in many of those proposals, lifting most, if not all, sanctions. And if that would be on the table, and there's indication that it could be, that could actually tempt Russia to freeze. We know that their negotiation tactic is to go in always with maximalist demands. That's been around for so many decades, ever since we've had modern negotiations, right? But in the end, they do need the money. And so that's something that I don't know how it will impact the next few months. However, before we turn to our second segment, I promised to talk about Romania. And it's difficult to talk about Romania because we seem to be sort of still in the middle. So the only thing that I can do is try to sum it up. So we were supposed to have 3 rounds of elections generally, first and second round of presidential, and in between parliamentary. And in the first round of presidential elections, only the last few days showed a very sharp, unprecedented rise of an independent candidate called Călin Georgescu, that this rise looks like it is due to TikTok algorithms. There's been been hearings in the European Parliament on this, but not everything has been clarified yet. And he's not the only one, the only candidate that has benefited from these algorithms in the election, with probably money behind and probably illicit money behind, though it has not been established yet what the origins of this money are. And so he came in first with 23%. And then second in came Elena Lasconi, running for a centrist party, but a non-establishment party. And then came the usual suspects that we were expecting to be the heads or the proposals of the mainstream parties, the older parties. So this was clearly a vote of Romanians, an angry vote against the system, against the establishment parties for mismanagement and for arrogance, frankly, over the last few years in the context of the post-pandemic recovery, as well as in the context of the full-scale invasion and the economic hardships that came with it. Then we had parliamentary elections, and in between, it was revealed that Călin Georgescu is, I don't know if I can use a bad word on the podcast, so is very crazy, that would be. He says things like water is not H2O, but it's information. He believes in massive conspiracy theories. He says NATO is the weakest alliance the world has ever seen. He doesn't like the United States. He thinks the United States has run out of resources. So things that are far right, but also don't make sense. But he wouldn't be the only one that does this nowadays. And he also turned out to be not just far right, but extreme right. To me, the most problematic remark has been one that he made after first round of the presidential elections. He said it twice, that when he becomes president, or if he becomes president, there will be no more political parties in Romania. That's, intention of regime change. And ever since, we've had attempts of preventive arrests of bodyguards around him that were heavily armed, and lots of scandals that still have to be clarified. But what has happened constitutionally or process-wise is that the first round of the presidential elections, with these shocking results for many, have led to the Constitutional Court first ordering a recount of the votes, though that had never been requested, then validating the vote, and then the Supreme National Defense Council declassified in a first move a series of documents that showed or suggested that there's foreign interference, though without the ability to pin down Russia or only Russia, and that there's been issues with his financing of the campaign and what he declared, and as well with some cyber attacks, massive cyber attacks from 30-something countries. And after this declassification, and after the Constitutional Court had initially validated the vote, it annulled the vote and it canceled the second round hours after the diaspora had started voting already. And so now what is going on is that the non-far right parties are building a coalition for the parliamentary elections. The parliamentary elections have not been highlighted as a problem, though also not confirmed that there weren't any problems in terms of election interference. And the overall result is that we have a sharp rise in the far-right parties from 2020 at about 9% to now 2024 in both elections, a total of 30-something%. And there's significant narrative overlaps with Russia. Călin Georgescu also says that Romania should be following the model of Russia or Russian wisdom, something like that. So that's it in a nutshell.
I mean, it sounds, to this outside observer, at least sounds really troubling. I mean, this sounds the closest Romania in my memory has come to a full-fledged constitutional crisis, really. Sort of annulling of elections is a pretty big deal, and so obviously been reading a little bit on Romania and you sort of hinted at this Russian interference, but I'm not entirely convinced that what we've seen and TikTok accounts and this, that and the other thing, that it would be completely out of line with patterns we've seen in earlier elections in Europe or in the United States, where obviously such measures have not been taken. And I wonder if sort of heavy-handed treatment of a candidate like him might not actually strengthen him and might not bode ill for the parliamentary vote.
Yeah, there's certainly a risk of that. Putin himself has weighed in to say, well, when they don't like the candidate, they recount or they annul the vote. And so some people make the argument that's actually giving this side more arguments. Indeed, when it comes to proven foreign malign election interference, we have at this moment publicly less to go on than we had in previous elections. And there is the issue of the Pandora box. What do we do? Should we annul all elections over the last decade in the West? Because we've had massive election interference proven over hundreds of pages, including, right? And what do we do with elections from now on? The Romanian authorities are now trying to figure out how to organize it for spring so that the same mistakes are being avoided. And in the meantime, there's still the issue of will he be ruled out? There's another far-right candidate that was ruled as unconstitutional to run for president a few weeks before the election, with a motivation that from the Constitutional Court that was not well written. So yeah, there's a lot of questions looming, though indeed Western headlines have been almost creating an equal sign with Russian interference, but there are a lot of questions that remain to be answered in coming weeks, and also the discussion of exactly who will be running next time. With that, I think we will be segueing now to our second part with our guest today, our guest of honor, Fred Kagan. And for our second segment, we have Fred Kagan with us. Fred, it's great to have you back. It's been a while. Would you start us off with an overview of the battlefield and where we are right now in Ukraine? How worried should we be about Russian advances?
Well, thanks so much for having me back, Yulia and Dalibor. It's wonderful to be with you both. It's complicated. The Russians are making advances. The Russians are now threatening the town of Pokrovsk from the south, and there is definitely a possibility that they will ultimately manage to take Pokrovsk. And they're also putting pressure on Chasiv Yar, which matters a lot, and on Kupiansk. And in general terms, they're attacking along the entire front line and making gains, and the Ukrainians have not been able to stop the advances per se, all of which is distressing and problematic, and it can turn into a more serious problem if it continues indefinitely. I don't think that it will continue indefinitely, though. And I think that the discussions that have been coming to the fore in the press about the losses that the Russians are taking are actually extremely important. The Russians are making what are still limited territorial gains. They have not yet taken a major city. Pokrovsk itself is not a major city. It's a significant location because it's a logistics hub and other things, but it's not a major city. And the Russians are not really showing any likelihood of being able to take a major city anytime soon. And the gains that they're making are still relatively small. To put it in context, from the advance through Avdiivka through the current front line is an advance to a depth of about 40 kilometers. And the Russians have taken hundreds of thousands of casualties to make that advance. That's really not sustainable for any military. And we're already seeing the Russians suffering from manpower problems themselves, challenges in their own mobilization, and from trade-offs that they have to make between military manpower and industrial manpower that's hindering their mobilization of their defense industrial base. And then in addition to that, we are observing carefully the Russian vehicle losses, which are particularly noteworthy because the Russians are not able to produce combat vehicles fast enough to support the rates of losses that they're sustaining, and they're not going to be able to address that anytime soon at all, if at all. And that actually is translating into a reduction in the number of combat vehicles that the Russians are putting onto the battlefield. All of which means that although the Russians are making advances, they're making advances at foot pace. And in that sense, the advances that they're making are much more like World War I style advances in terms of rate and also in terms of the casualties that they're taking. This is not an offensive that the Russians are going to be able to continue to sustain indefinitely, and in that sense, at least as long as the West continues to provide support to Ukraine. And in that sense, I think the likelihood is growing that in the coming months this Russian offensive probably will culminate, and the pressure will at a minimum ease on Ukraine, and possibly, depending on circumstances, the Ukrainians may have opportunities for limited counterattacks.
In mid-October, I, alongside some of our EGI colleagues, visited NATO headquarters, and one kind of line that was offered to us by some NATO officials was that the Russians were at the time making small but steady tactical gains. And those gains might well add up to a major strategic advantage over time. So your sense is that, compared to mid-October, that major strategic advantage has not materialized yet.
No, absolutely, it has not. And it's a very long time from here to a major strategic advantage. At best, the Russians would be looking at some operationally significant advances and advantages. But in terms of, you're talking about what is a strategic advantage, using levels of war properly, you're talking about something that fundamentally reshapes the entire theater. That's extraordinarily unlikely. It's very hard to see how the Russians get from where they are here to something like that, again, unless Western support for Ukraine collapses or the Ukrainian armed forces collapse, which I think is very unlikely. So we would be talking at best for the Russians about operationally significant advances that would fundamentally change a portion of the front line. And again, we have to put this all into perspective. So it certainly would be a operationally significant loss for Ukraine to lose Pokrovsk. On the other hand, Pokrovsk is a small town. It is not on the road to anywhere in particular, except in the sense that it's closer to the Donetsk Oblast border. And its loss would not portend the collapse of the entire, Ukrainian Eastern Front or any such thing. Likewise, even the loss of Chasiv Yar, which would be operationally significant, would be significant because it would give the Russians the opportunity to begin attacking the Ukrainian fortress belt of Konstantinivka and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk directly. But those are significant fortified cities. So, again, it's important to recognize here that even if the Russians succeed in their current efforts, they still will not have taken any major city, and they still will be left with the task of major fights, either over long distances or against major fortified urban areas or both, in order to make what would be strategically significant gains. So the losses the Russians are taking for these gains are really, really, really disproportionate to the significance of these gains. And that's a point that we need to not lose sight of.
All right, so you're telling us that the Russians are grinding on slowly, and we've seen that in the headlines too, that the losses are significant, if not enormous. You can say that you're somewhere in between on the spectrum. So what are we looking at then in terms of variables in the coming months? We have military aid for Ukraine from the United States that has been slow to come in based on the promises from the supplemental from 2024. And we have an incoming administration that talks a lot about ceasefire negotiations. And one of the plans is to continue arming Ukraine under certain circumstances. I'm guessing that would need a supplemental too, but not all of that is a given. And of course, there's a lot of questions around whether these negotiations will actually take place. So with all these variables, what should we be looking at on the operational side of things in the coming months?
Well, look, the first thing is we do need to recognize that the Biden administration has been unfathomably irresponsible in the delay of the provision of the assistance authorized in the supplemental. And that really has been causing enormous problems. I and many others, I think, hoped that as soon as the supplemental passed, the administration would have prepared large stocks of material and would have begun flooding Ukraine with those stocks, and it didn't do that. It is, ironically, sort of doing that now, and the fear that Trump will not provide any more assistance appears to be goading the Biden administration to be flooding the pipeline now as best it can. That can generate a slightly odd effect, because if there is sort of now finally a bow wave of material being pushed through the pipeline that will reach the Ukrainians as Russian forces get deeper and deeper into what may start to look like a culmination, that could create a surprising situation where the Ukrainians actually have opportunities later in the winter or the spring. It's hard to say, but that's one weird possibility here.
So relatedly, and one common narrative is that because Russians are making these steady advances on the battlefield, that they might not have any interest in negotiations, and therefore the Trump team will be disappointed at seeing lack of interest on the Russian side. But what you're saying is that if Russians are really sort of reaching the limit of where they can go, especially around Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, maybe a ceasefire to regroup, rearm, and prepare for something in the future might be also in their interest?
Well, okay. Look, First of all, I think that people are really jumping way ahead with a whole bunch of assumptions about a lot of things here, and I think that we need to dial it back a bit. I don't think anybody has a right to be confident about what the incoming administration is going to do. There have been a lot of statements, there's been a lot of leaks, there's been a lot of reports. Virtually none of them have come from the president-elect himself. Most of them have come from proxies one way and another. That messaging has generally been rather indisciplined. I think that we are going to need to wait and see. The president has said some clear things about wanting a ceasefire immediately and wanting to negotiate a settlement and so on. But in terms of whether he was going to provide aid or not, the president-elect hasn't made any clear statements about that. And I think people are really making a lot of assumptions that are not necessarily well-founded. So I think we're going to need to wait and see what the incoming administration actually does. I think it is going to be disappointed to the extent that it is expecting Putin to be more reasonable. And I say that because the Russians are continually reiterating that they have no intention of being reasonable. And just yesterday, I think it was Zakharova said Russians will make no concessions. I think that's Putin's position. I think Putin has no intention of making any concessions. I think Putin thinks that he's winning. I think that he believes that Trump will cut off aid. I think that he believes that Ukraine will collapse. And I think that he thinks that he can win it all. And I think that the almost maniacal fixation that he now has on grinding through territory of dubious significance at whatever the cost is in part a bluff intended to persuade everybody that the Russians can just keep doing this forever, and so we might as well all quit now. But I don't think that that's going to work in truth. I don't think it's going to work in Ukraine, and I don't think it's going to work here.
If he cannot grind on forever, which is what you were explaining a bit earlier, and it could be a maximalist tactic, right? The Soviets have been doing it before. Wouldn't then be the prospect eventually, in 6 months or so, of lifting the sanctions, of stabilizing the situation economically and socially in Russia, incentive enough to at least consider negotiations?
I think Putin is in a very complicated position and a very interesting sort of headspace. I don't really like to speculate about the psychology of foreign leaders, but I mean, when you look at his rhetoric, when you look at the people who have surrounded him, and when you look at the ideology that he is co-creating with the ultranationalist community, you look at the sunk cost, and I do think that he is increasingly a victim of a sunk cost fallacy here. I think that he will be extremely reluctant to accept a ceasefire that is a significant climb down from the terms that he's put out unless he is actually confronted with a military defeat on the battlefield of sufficient significance that he's persuaded that he's actually in danger of beginning to lose significant gains that he's made and have things really go badly for him on the battlefield in a way that he can't turn around. I think as long as he thinks that he will be able to sort of reset and continue in some way without having to climb down on his demands, he's going to try to do that. And that's why I think working hard to help Ukraine inflict a significant battlefield setback on him is going to be essential to changing his calculus. And I think he will try hard to prevent the culmination. I think what's going to happen is that he's going to be confronted probably in several months with the requirement to order another involuntary reserve call-up. I think he probably will. I think he'll delay that for as long as he can. I think he'll try to limit it as much as he can, and he'll try to use North Korean troops and various other shenanigans to limit the impact of that. But I think that when confronted with the choice of doing that or calling it off, I think he'll probably order another partial reserve call-up. I think it's going to be harder than people imagine to get him to climb down from the demands that he's made, even for a temporary ceasefire. So we'll see, but I'm just not seeing any indication. I'm seeing a lot of reasoning. I'm seeing a lot of people reasoning about, well, if I were Putin, I would want to pause. And I can see how a ceasefire would benefit him. I can make that argument as cogently and persuasively as anybody else. The problem is that when you just look at any actual indicators and statements and actions that the Russians are pursuing, there's just no basis to support the idea that he's thinking in that way.
This past week, Putin, in a very different context, turned his back on one of his clients in the Middle East, in Syria, basically vacated the place, didn't attempt any pushback against the advancing rebel forces. Were you surprised by this development? And do you think this development tells us anything about the fragility of Russian power in a way that could perhaps portend good news for Ukraine going forward?
Well, I wasn't surprised that the Russians didn't do anything because there really wasn't anything they could do. To understand what happened in Syria, you need to understand what's been going on in Syria and what the Russians have been providing. And for years, the only thing the Russians have been providing has been air cover, air power, some intelligence support, and very, very limited Spetsnaz capabilities. The Russians have never provided significant ground forces or ground forces capabilities to that conflict. They've relied on the Iranians and their proxies and the Assad regime's own forces for the ground forces. So what actually happened to trigger this? Well, the Israelis wrecked Hezbollah and deprived the Assad regime of the Hezbollahi forces that were very important. And Assad and the Iranian axis of resistance, so focused on the fight against Israel, had basically let the proxies that had been essential components of the Syrian Arab army sort of kind of hollow out. In that circumstance, and considering the rapidity with which the regime ground forces collapsed, there really wasn't anything the Russians could have done if they were not prepared to send, motorized rifle divisions to Syria, which they probably couldn't have done in time anyway. So I think it tells us a limited amount about Putin and the Russian military capability. I think it tells us a lot about mistakes that the Iranians and their proxies made. So I think we should not read too much into Russian military capacities based on what the Russians did or did not do in Syria. Now, I think the loss of Syria has important implications for Russia globally and in the Middle East, and certainly the appearance that the Russians just gave up on Assad, told him he was going to lose, and told him to get out of there, in a wonderful ironical contrast to the interaction with Zelensky early in the war. They gave him a ride, not ammo, but realistically, I don't think there was much that they were actually going to be able to do, and I don't think that shows any particularly greater limitation on Russian military capabilities than they had before.
Fred Kagan, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been great to be with you.
Turning now to our third part, Dalibor, what is your recommendation for today?
I really enjoyed an article written by Ambrose Evans Pritchett in the Daily Telegraph, where he looks at the state of the Russian economy almost 3 years into the war, and he concludes that the Russian economy is in an extremely fragile state that's reminiscent of the situation facing Germany in 1917, but it essentially ran out of skilled manpower and rendered all of its private sector unprofitable and unsustainable. And right now, Russians have been so heavy-handed in trying to convert its economy on a war footing that they really sort of have overheated the economy. They have significant labor shortages. They have interest rates now at 21%, the sort of central bank set rate, which essentially are threatening all of the private sector with bankruptcy. And they are running out of the kind of real reserves, not just sort of foreign exchange reserves, but you see that in the exchange rate of the ruble. You see it in the sort of domestic upward pressure on prices that are getting out of control. And as a result, this might not be the best time to try to bring the war to an end if we are interested in bankrupting Putin's Russia. Actually, this might be the time to try to put pressure on Russia in a consistent fashion for the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And it is more likely than not that the Russians will be in a far, far weaker economic situation and perhaps facing a full-fledged economic meltdown if the current trends continue. So that to me was an interesting, well-researched piece that is very well worth looking at.
That does sound interesting, and it makes me think of what I was just saying a bit earlier on the episode, that it is a matter of the sanctions, right? What is going to be put on the table, and I'm guessing the more, based on this timeline that's suggested in your recommendation, that the more one would drag this out, the more Russia will have an incentive to want to negotiate towards a ceasefire to be able to recover some of its economic power. Before we wrap up, also a small recommendation from me. This time it's one of my pieces, a piece that I've written for my institute, the Middle East Institute, on Iran's growing influence in the Black Sea region. I'm looking at both Iran's increasing footprint northwards in the South Caucasus and beyond into the Black Sea, but also at how the Iran-Russia cooperation is prompting and increasing, or enabling rather, Iran in the region, and something that the West, both the United States as well as Europeans, including when looking at possible negotiations and possible sanctions towards Iran, should be taking into account. With that, we're wrapping up our episode today.
As we head into the new year, we'll be taking a break because we will be back with more content But in the meantime, we are wishing everybody very happy holidays and an excellent start to the new year, and obviously wishing the best for our Ukrainian friends as they face Russian aggression.
And with that, thank you for listening to the Eastern Front, a podcast on the security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests or topics you'd like us to look at. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.